The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent, including Olas Media.
Olas Media presents Inside the Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert.
I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files.
Inside the Crime Files is produced by Olas Media in San Diego, California.
Welcome to Inside Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert podcast. I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this podcast takes listeners inside and behind the scenes of the investigation and the prosecution of some of the most horrific and notorious criminal cases in California history. We've also examined some of the most unique cases that we've seen with sometimes unexpected endings. But recently, we've also decided to start talking about some of the policy issues that in fact impact crime. And so we're going to start that today. We're going to talk to two of my favorite people about some of the policies and some of the laws that have impacted crime in California, and really what I say oftentimes adds to that human toll of crime. And in particular today, we're going to be talking about what I call, and many others call, the early release of prisoners. And my guests today are Greg Totten, who is the CEO of the California District Attorneys Association, as well as Ralph Diaz, who is the executive director of an organization called Stand Up for Victims, and he is the former director or secretary of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So thank you. Welcome, both of you.
Hello, Anne-Marie.
Okay, let me just start off. Greg, Mr. Totten, we've known each other for a long time, but just maybe tell us about your background and kind of how you landed as the CEO of the California DAs Association.
Well, it's great to be with you, Anne-Marie. And my background is I've been a prosecutor for essentially 40 years. I principally was a prosecutor in Ventura County, where I ultimately became the elected district attorney and served 5 terms as the elected DA of that county. I currently serve as the chief executive officer for the California District Attorneys Association. That is an association that represents 3,500 prosecutors statewide and 56 elected district attorneys. We're an organization that provides both training and legislative advocacy on behalf of prosecutors. And our focus is to protect crime victims and ensure that we have the laws that we need to protect the communities we serve.
And so for the listeners' sake, before I get to you, Ralph, Greg, you kind of like me, grew up in the trenches. You were actually a trial attorney. You prosecuted many, many types of crimes, violent crimes. And perhaps what our listeners most remember is the fact that you were a key part of the Golden State Killer prosecution as the district attorney for Ventura County.
Yes, interestingly enough, that case literally was the first case I ever worked on after walking through the doors of the Ventura DA's office as a law student and a law clerk. It was obviously a horrific case. We had a very prominent couple from Ventura County, Lyman and Charlene Smith, that were brutally murdered at night in their home in a nice neighborhood in the city of Ventura.
Yes, and just a little bit of trivia is that it was that case that ultimately led to the identification of the Golden State Killer, because thankfully there was extra evidence that was collected in that case. So I'm very grateful for that. Ralph Diaz, I've known you for a long time as well, have tremendous respect for you, but maybe just tell the listeners kind of about your background and what you're doing now.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. It's good to see you and Greg, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast here. Well, I was a career prison person, so I joined the Department of Corrections and served from correctional officer to supervisor to executive, was a warden, was an administrator, and eventually was a 5-time appointee to various positions at the executive level between Governor Brown and ultimately Governor Newsom, and finally made it to the position of the Secretary of the Department of Corrections, where I served in that capacity right to the end of my career. And like Greg, the career in law enforcement. Grew up in a law enforcement family. My dad was a sheriff, city police, homicide investigator. Mom was in corrections, and it's just been always in my blood. And in 2020, when I retired, I knew that my work wasn't done. I always had victims at the at the forefront of my mind because I've always thought that they were the one group that's always been not given enough attention, especially in the legislative or the policy development within California corrections, and they're left out of the loop, almost having to be begging for attention and begging for an audience with people that are changing laws that directly impact them. And so soon after my retirement, I approached some individuals and said, I think this would be a good organization. And here we are. We're almost a little over 2 years into it, and we're doing great work, working directly with victims, informing them of their rights. The bulk of the work that Stand Up for Victims does is helping individuals navigate the Board of Prison Hearings process, help them understand the complex credit earning process, and answer questions when they call and say, the person who impacted my family was supposed to do 10 years, and yet I'm getting a notice that they're getting out on year 3.5. And they just don't understand it. So,
and they're shocked. They're shocked oftentimes.
They're shocked. Yes, they are. So that's what I've been doing, amongst other things. But this is pretty much the bulk of what I've been doing since retirement.
Let me ask you this, Ralph, before we kind of get into the policy issues. What, in terms of the California Department of Corrections, how big is it? How many prisons? Kind of what were we at with the height of the prison population? Because people always hear these terms, mass incarceration and that kind of stuff, but maybe kind of give folks an understanding of who's in prison now, how many prisons do we have, how many inmates, that kind of thing.
So the last time I checked, the current population in prison right now, actually in a prison cell or in a prison bunk somewhere, there's about 91,000 individuals in a state prison somewhere right now, encompassing 33 prisons throughout California, all the way from the Oregon border down to the Mexican border. Right now, it's probably the lowest population since I've been associated with corrections. When I began in 1991, I remember being trained and told we're at the height of our population, state prison history, at 100,000. I didn't know what that meant as a young officer. But as years went by, we got to years 2012, 2013, our population boomed up to about 175,000 in prison. And that was a lot of individuals, and the willingness and the desire by the lawmakers to erect or open up or fund any more facilities just wasn't there. So we shipped a lot of people out of state. And then beginning in 2011, probably with AB 109, then trickling to 2014 with Prop 47, the prison population decreased. It started decreasing rapidly for numerous reasons. Number one, the primary reason was the federal court ordered the population. We got put under a federal oversight under a 3-judge panel that we had to bring our prison population down to a design capacity of 137.5% of our prison capacity. And we're well below that now in 2023. So since then, since 2011 to where we are, a lot has happened in California corrections, everything from releases to court oversight to early releases to the ever-increasing speed of Board of Prison hearings that lifers are coming to hearings, which throw victims in front of people that they otherwise may not be in front of for another decade, but yet they're in front of these people. I'm not prepared, so I'm asking a lot of questions, and that's where Stand Up for Victims comes in.
So what is and Greg, you can chime in too, but what's the snapshot of somebody that's in prison now? Because I think there's a lot of probably misunderstanding or misinformation on, the guy that stole a loaf of bread is in prison, or, in terms of what does that snapshot look like of those 90,000? How would you describe those?
They're overwhelmingly people who have committed crimes against persons. This myth that's out there that the prisons are full of low-level thieves and drug offenders is just, it is just that. It is a myth.
Right.
Overwhelmingly, the prison population, and I'm sure Ralph knows this only too well, are people that, by and large, are exceedingly dangerous. Many of them generally have 5 or more felony convictions, so they're career criminals in one form or another, and the vast majority of them have committed crimes against persons. Perhaps not for the most recent commitment offense, but they have records of those types of offenses in their background.
Right.
It takes a lot.
Right.
You really have to, as a criminal offender, you really have to work at it today to get to prison. You have to be a pretty bad person.
Right. And I think it's important that folks understand, Greg, you're a prosecutor. You still call yourself a prosecutor. I guess
Yes,
I do a
ma'am.
little bit. Ralph, you've grown up in law enforcement world, corrections. I mean, what's your views on rehabilitation? Because some folks think we just want to lock people up, which I know personally and professionally for myself, that was very far from the truth. But let me start with you, Ralph. I think you and I are fairly aligned philosophically, but, maybe let the listeners know your view on it and kind of why this is such an important topic.
Oh, yeah, I think we are aligned, and I even think Greg's aligned here also. I'm a champion of rehabilitation. I'm a champion of a person coming to prison for the prescribed period of time as allotted by law, but during that time that they get meaningful rehabilitative opportunities. When I mean meaningful, it goes beyond just the old days of giving them a job, teaching them how to make shoes and upholster and fix small engines. Those days are gone in California prison rehabilitation. Now it's so evolved and advanced. We have our own division of rehabilitation within corrections, which is well funded, nearly at a $600 million bill right now to provide rehabilitative programs, everything from education, vocation, cognitive behavior therapies, self-improvement, wellness. The catalog that's provided to the inmates, the ones that want it, is rich. And it's meaningful and it's purposeful. It's well beyond the programs that existed in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, which was hardly any. And that was at the time when we were overcrowded, recognizing that people were coming in and out of prison at a rapid pace, the revolving door. And the reality was rehabilitation was very low. The thought of just sending them to prison and taking them from the communities was going to be enough of a deterrent. But the reality is we weren't educating them. They were coming in.
Right.
More than half of them came in with no high school diploma. A third of them couldn't read. And therefore, the only way that they could advocate for themselves was to act out.
Right.
And so come to prison, just survive and sustain themselves and get out and just return. So I'm a champion of rehabilitation. I think focusing on the rehabilitation of our sex offenders is critical. And I know sex offender rehabilitation is woefully underfunded and hard to get in California prisons or any prison around the country because there's a large population of sex offenders in our prisons who are going home faster due to the increased credits allowed. And my hope and my prayer is that they receive receive the programs and training and insight and behavior changing type therapy that they need so they don't go out and reoffend.
Right.
Right. I'm a champion of rehabilitation. I'm a champion of second chances, third chances for people because I recognize not everybody's raised in the neighborhoods that I was raised in and had the opportunities I did. But there comes a time when our compassion is at times misguided by society and thinking that less time and don't send someone to prison. That's really the compassionate way. But the reality is some of these people need these valuable rehabilitative programs that the state prison is funded and that the counties just can't make individuals complete.
Right. We're going to get to sex offenders in a little bit, but Greg, how about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think rehabilitation has a very prominent and significant role, and I think I reflect the views of the vast majority of prosecutors in California. If we can get somebody into a rehabilitation program that changes their trajectory, that changes their life in a positive way so they become a law-abiding, productive citizen, that's a huge accomplishment. That's a net positive from a cost standpoint. It's a net positive from the criminal justice system standpoint. And so many DAs, as we did in Ventura County, we had our own administered diversion programs where we could divert people out of the criminal justice system into rehabilitative type programs, and prosecutors are strong supporters of those programs. But at the same time, as Ralph indicated, there comes a point at which with an offender that we also recognize that incapacitation through incarceration prevents them from hurting more people.
Right.
And so there are some offenders that you can throw a ton of resources at, a ton of effort at, and still they're not going to change that behavior, and still they're going to present a grave threat to the public. And that's what, we need to focus on in our incarceration efforts, is those people who present the greatest threat to our communities. And right now, unfortunately, the tide has turned. There's an ebb and flow in criminal justice policy, but right now our policy is really favoring criminals over victims. And by doing that, it's not only disregarding the interest of victims, it's not only disregarding the protection of victims, it's disregarding issues of core safety of our communities. And that's why we're seeing homicide spikes and we're seeing crime escalate in so many communities across the state.
Yeah, no, very true. So we're going to talk today a little bit about what has often been called early release. And it's, that's kind of the catchphrase now in the media and things like that. But let me just ask you, Ralph, I mean, you were the Secretary of Corrections when this thing called Prop 57 was passed. I'm sure you're intimately familiar with it. But, first of all, let's define, or how would you define what's called early release?
What I would call early release is, I believe, what happened post Prop 57 when the access to increased credit earning capabilities to violent offenders that wasn't originally part of the Prop 57 plan was given to violent offenders, which included life for inmates, which expedited their appearance before board hearings. So I consider all of those new credits that are afforded to violent and sex offenders, which were never intended, as early releases. The intent of Prop 57, when it was voted on by nearly 60% of the voters that year, was to afford non-violent offenders enhanced credit opportunities with the thought of they're going out, they're getting out regardless of what anybody says. We need to incentivize rehabilitation so they can participate. Much has changed since then. What I see occurring now, violent inmates under 667.5C are receiving the wonderful credits that the California citizens thought this would be good, and they're getting out faster than the rehabilitative process can actually make an impact upon them. One statistic that stands out with me and it never left me was the lowest recidivist category of an individual was a lifer inmate who served 25 years that has participated in an education, a vocation, cognitive behavior therapy class, substance abuse disorder class, and have meaningful relationships and return opportunities upon release for housing and even job opportunities. Their recidivism rate is less than 1%.
Because they've done the work.
Because they've done the work. And if you ask any individual who fits in that category and they answer honestly, they will say, my lifestyle changed over time. Sadly, what's happening, individuals that are serving 12 to 36 months in their state prisons, there's no way that they're getting any meaningful rehabilitation that's going to change their lifestyle. And those are the individuals who are at the highest risk level to commit violent crimes. And I think something has to be done. Someone has to say, to get in front of somebody that said this is not working.
So let me break it down a little bit first, and maybe Greg can chime in here because, for the listeners, under California law, when Prop 57 passed, the promise was to nonviolent people that we're going to let people out early that are nonviolent. And the truth is, and Greg, maybe you can talk about this, that there's some very violent people that are winning basically the benefit of Prop 57 because of the law, correct?
Correct.
Maybe define, kind of tell us the types of crimes that people don't really realize.
So, let me just give a little context. When we talk about credits, we also talk about truth in sentencing. And the reality is today we do not have truth in sentencing. So these individuals who are given 10, 15-year sentences under Proposition 57, if their current offense is not a violent felony, and let me be clear, domestic violence. Violence is in the description of the crime, and yet it is not considered a violent felony, notwithstanding repeated efforts of our association and others to have it added to the violent felony list. So somebody who has committed a violent felony, like domestic violence, and has prior violent felonies in their background, they're essentially automatically getting 50% credits. The day they walk in the door, their time for every day they serve, they get a day of credit. So a 10-year sentence converts into a 5-year sentence by statutory law. Then you add to that these credits on steroids that Prop 57 authorizes CDCR to give that inmate. They can get early released because domestic violence is a nonviolent felony under the law, or they can even get enhanced steroids. So what we're seeing is many of those sentences that have already been cut in half by statute are again cut in half by some of the credits that are awarded or the early release. And so as Ralph said, you've got people who have serious issues, have serious behavior and criminality, and they're not in CDCR long enough to receive any rehabilitative services, and they're put back on our streets.
Yeah, one of the ones, I mean, Ralph, you and I talked about this, but one of the ones that I find so, to some extent, offensive is this, what's called good conduct credits, which is essentially don't misbehave and we'll let you out early. I mean, is that a fair statement?
That sums it up. And the whole concept behind good conduct credits is that individuals don't misbehave, don't commit rules infractions that disrupt the order of the facility, and that those that disrupt the order of the facility by either violent behavior or gang pressures, both of those things really disrupt an individual's ability or willingness to participate in rehabilitation. That's the concept behind good conduct credits. But there was a time when only a non-violent offender who was assigned to a program, meaning job or an education program, would receive it. An individual who chose, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to do nothing, I'm just going to sit here, they were going to serve 80% of their time.
Yeah.
The violent offender. And there were those people. And then if they got in trouble, they would serve what we'd call flat time. They'd serve their whole sentence, and they'd really have to be acting up. And there was a lot of individuals like that. But even those people now have the opportunity to get 50%. They don't have to participate in anything, which confounds me because that's not the intent or the way it was designed. And this is really stems from litigation on Prop 57 after the regulations were promulgated by corrections. Lawsuits were filed stating that these violent offenders and sex offenders, the intent of the law was for them also, which it was not.
Well, and even before Prop 57 was passed, Greg Totten and I talked extensively about the fact, and I think we told the governor at the time,
we did.
You cannot, you are going to get sued by the sex offenders by trying to exclude them. And nobody wanted to believe us. And then, of course, the voters were promised, don't worry, we're not going to let sex offenders out early. And then what happened, Greg?
Precisely what we warned him would happen. All of those lawsuits were successful. Mm-hmm. And today, sex offenders and other violent offenders can be the beneficiaries of these enhanced credits. It's worth pointing out, too, that in terms of state prison population, at our high water mark, I think it was in excess of 175,000 statewide. Today, that number, as Ralph pointed out, is down in the low 90,000 range. So prison population has been cut in half. And, for many of us who have been around and seen crime over the years, we're not surprised that crime is starting to go up. Proposition 57 did a number of things. In addition to creating the ability for somebody who has committed their current offense as a nonviolent offense, such as domestic violence, or rape of an unconscious woman, or human trafficking, those offenses are considered nonviolent. And so that person, without regard to what their prior record is, can be early released by CDCR in its discretion. That's the first provision. The second provision gives CDCR the ability to award enhanced credits. So there's two different ways that person can get benefited. The enhanced credits has also been applied to violent felons and murderers by regulation. Historically, murderers got no credits. They became eligible for consideration, but they got no credits for purposes of expediting the date upon which they become eligible for parole consideration. All of that has been changed by Prop 57. And so today, our prison population is at a low watermark, and our crime is definitely on the increase, and more people are being victimized.
One of the other ones that I just wanted to briefly mention that I would consider a quote early release is there's been lots of laws passed in the last several years. There's what's called youthful offenders. So if you're under 25, it started out as whatever, under 21, and then it went up to 25. Then there's one that I think you guys all know about, but elderly parole. Ralph, why don't you explain for the listeners what is elderly parole?
I'd have to probably brush up on the ages, but really the thought is that if a person serves 50% of their time and they are, I think, age 65.
I'm going to correct you because it has changed, actually.
Yeah. So,
so under elderly parole, it started out that, like, let's say you're a murderer. Let's say, like, I had a guy I prosecuted for a very violent serial rapist. He was sentenced by a judge to 500 years to life because his history was so bad. He was so dangerous. So he gets 500 to life, which, the victims all believe that means he's never getting out. Well, here comes this new law called elderly parole, which basically started out initially at you had to be 60 and serve 25 years. But it's now been changed, which I'm personally offended by. But now you have to be 50. You're considered elderly at 50 in the prison system. You can't collect a Social Security, and you only have to serve 20 years. So it's shocking, but it's more shocking for crime victims. And for instance, I did a murder trial in my earlier days. The guy was sent a horrible domestic violence murder, sentenced to 26 years to life. Family was devastated by the loss of their daughter. And all of a sudden now he's up for elderly parole, and they had to go through another parole hearing. It's, that's what I call the really, like you're working on, Ralph, is the consequences of these policies without regard to crime victims.
Right. And 50 years of age with only 20 years served, if that were me and having done prison for 30 years and watching individuals grow in their rehabilitation or decline in their rehabilitation, one of the two, they know these numbers better than us. They know exactly what they have to do to get in front of a board for consideration. And part of the rehabilitative process now, there are groups that come in on a self-help basis. In essence, what they do is they prepare the individual for the hearing, not to test the veracity or the sincerity of their rehabilitation, but only to prepare them on what's the best way to present to the board.
Right.
And to me, there is an unfair advantage for the victim, who all they're trying to do is live their life and move on and heal from this. And there are no classes for them. There are no individuals that they can reach out to. If they have a great district attorney that still has passion for victims, they do help out. And there are counties out there, but there are many counties, including the largest county that sends people to the state prison system, Los Angeles. Those are no longer there.
Right.
They get the victims and send them to the Department of Corrections, to their Office of Victims and Survivors' Rights, and they do a great job. However, I have concerns that they can keep up with the amount of people going to board and preparing them with resources. And that's why groups like ours here talk to them, explain what's to be anticipated, what to expect. And for a person that's, say, 52 years old who did 20 years, that committed the crime when they're 27, for a board to test their sincerity based on what the law was before elderly parole, that'd be a tough one. To say that they are no longer a threat to society. That's a tough one. And I just think it's an unfair advantage on behalf of the victims, playing the pain that they went through and why the person should stay in.
Well, I think it's also important for folks to understand there's a difference between somebody that's sentenced to what's called an indeterminate term, meaning you got to go in front of a parole board or a board to try to basically demonstrate you're safe now to release. Then there's the people that are what we call determinate, meaning you're a set time, maybe 12 years. But Prop 57 impacted both of those types of individuals, right?
Right. Yeah.
To some extent, it almost seems like it was more dangerous for the people that were given a set amount of time because of the fact that they're now getting out potentially at less than half their time.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Anne Marie, that during the time of the development of the regulations and during the comment period, and I believe this is going to come to pass, unfortunately, that the term life without parole is going to be severely impacted here in California because there was a huge push by large groups, including some groups that claim to be victim groups that are support of life without parole to be for hearings or sent back to court, or these laws are put there for a purpose. And life without parole is both the being DAs. It's something that you're going to wind up on St. Quentin's death row, which isn't being used anymore, or you're going to get life without parole. Sometimes they're pled down to life without parole just for the sake of the families not having to put them through it, and it doesn't mean it anymore.
What, Greg? From a perspective of someone that sat with, murder victim families or violent crime victim families, what does that do to a family that had to go through the most horrific time of their life? Judge says it's life without parole, or it's 500 to life. What does it do to that family when they then get a notice saying, "Oh, sorry, we changed the goalpost and we're going to change everything up for you"?
It's devastating. It is for them a re-victimization in every sense of the word. We've always said that the victims have to experience the crime, first of all, in all of its horror. Imagine a parent of a child that's been murdered and what they experience, what they go through just with the crime itself and the change that produces for their family. We've always said the criminal justice system, it's a system. And sometimes it can be unkind. We've made a lot of advances in helping victims through that criminal justice system. But now victims have to worry about the post-conviction system, the prison system, and the parole system. And when, we've told them, don't worry, this guy is never going to get out because we've gotten a very lengthy sentence. And then all of a sudden we're proven wrong. Because they're given early release, early parole, enhanced credits, or a parole board decides that they're safe to release for whatever reason. It is devastating to them, and it is like they are re-victimized a third time.
Right. So one of the things before, I want to ask you about some of the kind of horrific cases we've seen out of early releases, but one of the other things that I think is important for folks to understand is, we all talk about this word transparency in government. We want everybody to be able to see the data. And are these things working? Are these early releases working? Because we should be able to study these things. And I mean, Ralph and Greg, what's your experience been in terms of the, corrections, quote unquote, transparency, that we can see what is recidivism like? How are these people doing? I mean, what's your experience, Ralph?
Well, I mean, corrections has been tracking recidivism since 1977. And ironically, that's when California went from its indeterminate to its determinate sentencing laws, because I think the then Governor Jerry Brown wanted to start tracking some of the changes when it went to determinate sentencing, which in turn exploded the prison population. But I think from what I've seen now, we live and die by our recidivism reports in corrections. The Secretary of Corrections within the Division of Research every 3 years puts out a recidivism report. And the last one that was put out in 2015 and 16 has our numbers at about 46% of a recidivism rate with a conviction rate of 44.6%, which is the standard that they go by. But what concerns me is since the development of Prop 57, which was voted on in 16, implemented in about 2017, the next report that's going to come out, which is going to be 16, 17, 18, it's not going to have a lot of strong data on the full effects of Prop 57 when it comes out. And then I believe we're not going to see the true data of Prop 57 and the elderly parole and youthful offender until 2026. That's in 2 more rehabilitative recidivism report cycles. So for me, I think there has to be almost an annual recidivism report that we have to gauge and look at and find to see if we need to be there needs to be a course correction. So as it stands now, we wait for 3 years for people to evaluate what we've done, which is unfortunate.
Well,
we're due for the next report any day, and I'm looking forward to it. But I will say, in defense of corrections, which I have a lot of friends, there's still a lot of people still working in it. As a part of the executive branch, they're developing regulations based on what comes through law or the voters vote on. But when it comes to the regulatory process, there's still a lot of pressure, even within corrections, to develop a regulation that maybe stakeholders would see favorable for the citizens of California.
Yeah, you won't necessarily say this, and I'm not asking you to, but, there's pressure. There's pressure from the criminal justice advocates that, let's get more people out. Let's get more people out. We know that. I mean, this podcast is not political. It's actually just a reality that, these regulations or rules were adopted in a way that, we know from recent reports that, 15,000 people have been let out under these early release credits.
Right.
Because, and we don't have any real data to show, is it working or not? Right.
No, we don't. When I was sitting with then Governor Brown with the former secretary, Mr. Kernan, and him and I were almost on a weekly, daily basis visiting the governor's office in the development of these regulations. Jerry Brown said something then, I think he's even said it in interviews after he was out of office, that sentencing should not be the play toy of ambitious politics. It ought to be the judgment of serious-minded individuals who are not running for office.
Yeah.
Have in mind public safety and have in mind the change that men and women can make over time. He said that.
Totally agree.
And I agree with that. I agree with it. Unfortunately, I feel, and it's my belief, that Prop 57 has been hijacked from its original intent. It's been hijacked and is being used for the decarceration movement to depopulate our prisons. And I can't even guess why people want that to happen without holding people accountable. I really don't.
Right.
And I struggle with it without letting my emotions get involved, because I feel somewhat responsible in developing some of those regulations that now, as a private citizen, here I am seeing the effects. And
Right.
there are regrets on my end.
Right. Greg, in terms of the transparency, am my old brain accurate that your organization, the DA's Association, has been a strong advocate? In fact, there was a bill that you guys sought to introduce. Maybe tell the listeners kind of what it was and what happened.
Yeah, there was a bill by Assemblyman Patterson from the Fresno area. I think its number was AB 15. That sought to implement a transparency policy so that CDCR, rather than making these decisions kind of in a star chamber-like setting, and I'm not trying to demonize CDCR staff. I think there's a lot of good people there, but their current law essentially allows them to make these decisions without any transparency to the public or others. And this bill would have essentially required that they issue a report periodically detailing the amount of credits and early releases that they had given in a particular time period. And that bill, didn't get out of its first policy committee. I think, part of our frustration is when it comes to the early release, they're supposed to notify the DAs. And we routinely, when I was in Ventura County, we filed letters in early release cases where they were being considered. And I know you did the same thing in Sacramento. And we, as distinct from that as these credits cases, we have no way of knowing when somebody gets out. We're not notified that this person has been given a certain amount of credits. And DAs feel strongly about their cases, and they have insight and input that needs to be considered. And unfortunately, in the enhanced credits arena, DAs are not really given any procedural authorization to interject information into that process. And so it's troubling to us. We also have seen a case, this case out of Placer County. Darnell Irby received a lengthy prison sentence and was given an early release, and CDCR has since admitted that they failed in notifying the DA that he was given an early release. He went on to murder a 77-year-old woman and dismember her body.
Right.
And we're seeing cases like that. We've seen a murder of a police officer in Selma.
Right.
we've seen any number of cases where essentially in this push to reduce prison population, we've got officials that are forgetting the first responsibility of the government, which is to protect the public. And as a result, we're having more homicides, we're having more violent crimes, and I'm concerned that trend is going to continue. Now, I do think the public is waking up to it. By most national polls, public safety and crime is, in the top one or two issues that the public is concerned about. And you can't turn on the TV in any large metropolitan area in the state and watch the news and not see examples of really serious crime. And unfortunately, many of these people that are committing this serious crime are people that have benefited in under some of these, open the jailhouse door policies, as I like to call them. The other thing I just want to say is recidivism, it all depends upon how you define it. In the old days, the average recidivism rate of people released from prison was in the 70% range. That meant that they either committed a new offense or were arrested for a new offense or committed a violation of the terms and conditions of their parole within a 2-year period of their release. Well, most jurisdictions have redefined that. The state, to a degree, has redefined it to require additional, things like a felony arrest or a conviction, as Ralph mentioned earlier. And when you redefine recidivism, those numbers no longer become valid. Because you're not using the same standards, and it helps look good. It helps look like, hey, our recidivism rate used to be in the 70% range, and now we're down to 40. But in reality, to a large degree, we've redefined recidivism and get the numbers based upon that redefinition.
Right.
I will tell you, when it comes to recidivism numbers, as secretary, you're put in front of a lot of rules committees or Senate public safety committees, and they want to talk about reducing your dollars based on recidivism. And as the secretary, one number that I would point out quite often, and this may have been more self-serving than anything, was that the return to prison rate. I almost kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, hey, I can't control who's arrested. I can't control who's convicted. But, if they return to state prison, that should be the number. That number hovered around 23%, 22%, because it's a trifecta of numbers: conviction and arrest and return. That gives you the whole number. And that, the definition is going to be established by the Board of State and Community Corrections, which they'll define what recidivism is and what counting rule will exist. And I really hope they stick to the current counting rule when these next 2 recidivism reports come out. The one coming out should be out already, and then especially the one in 23.
Okay, we got a couple minutes left, but I want to just kind of end it on this topic of sex offenders, Ralph. And you mentioned that that's one of the areas that's severely lacking. I mean, first of all, how many sex offenders do you think are in prison at any given time?
The last number I looked at, and this was right about the time I was about retiring, it's about a third of the prison population are in there for some type of sex offense.
And that's concerning. And I remember you and I having a conversation. Everybody's worried about sex offenders because of not just because of the nature of the crimes, but how many actual sex offender programs, like sex offender specific programs, are there in the prison system?
Specifically to deal with their sex offense and their behavior, and to prevent them and give them other skills to leave that behavior, there's only one program in the state, and it's at one prison.
And how many people can be in it at a given time?
At the time, this is in 2020, it's less than 100. And I've looked at all the current data to see if anything has grown, looked in the current budget. There's nothing there, but there was only one at one prison, and it's less than 100 individuals. And it wasn't even full at the time, and it wasn't a mandatory placement. It was you were sent there, and if you were on that yard, you would go there. It's very hard to deal with that population, because basically what you're telling the rest of the prison population on that yard, if the yard has 1,000 inmates, you are forced to participate in that program from this time to this time. In essence, you're telling all the other inmates you're a sex offender because you're going to that class from 10 to 2 on Thursdays. Right. It is difficult. So it's you have to change a prison culture that that the inmates themselves dictate. The prison system doesn't say you will treat sex offenders bad. No, we enforce rules against that, but it's amongst that culture. But with as many sex offenders that exist, as many sex offenders that are leaving prison, the programs that deal specifically with that behavior are woefully not represented within corrections because, number one, it's a hard program to staff. The staffing for that, the treatment, the doctors, the mental health programs that exist with it, it's a very, very difficult one to staff.
Right. But I think the thing that's important is you've got this kind of tsunami of policies that have kind of come into play, and promises were initially made that we wouldn't let sex offenders out early. And now we're doing that. So when you have these, early releases, I mean, you and I have talked about this, we're letting them out without the rehab that's so woefully needed.
I'm sure that upon one of their conditions of parole, they probably have some of the most stringent conditions of parole. And, the parole agents, they can put them in programs and make sure that they're watched and observed. But unfortunately, the homelessness issue with the sex offender is high. So you have sex offenders who don't have a home that they can actually go visit and make sure they're there. That always kept me up at night as a secretary, making sure that we are monitoring our sex offenders when we let them out. And I would grill our director all the time. Hey, I'm looking at a number right now of 4,000 parolees at large. How many of them are sex offenders, and where are they? And it's scary.
Right. So, Greg, let me ask you, or both of you, as we kind of end this important conversation, what can listeners do? I mean, these are, what can our citizens do when they start understanding kind of what's going on here?
Well, one thing right out of the box that they can do, if they want information on what's going on in the California legislature, and so that they can contact their members directly, they can go on to the Golden State Communities, and it's just goldenstatecommunities.com. It is a nonprofit organization both Ralph and I are involved in, and they can sign up for information. We're putting out weekly information pieces to members, and if they want to, members of the public can use that website to contact their legislator directly via either calling their office, email, or sending them even a video message, should they choose to do so. So getting engaged, getting information. Clearly, right now we're in a cycle where this whole criminal justice reform issue that's been going on for the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years has endangered the public. And being aware, trying to take precautions to protect themselves, we certainly want to recommend that. But be engaged. If they have neighborhood watches in their community, join the neighborhood watch. Make sure you know something about your local police agency. But we need their help in advancing legislative policy that pushes back against this reform effort, because it's literally endangering every Californian.
No question. How about you, Ralph, from your perspective, both as a corrections secretary, but also with your organization now?
Like Greg, I echo what he says there, but also from a victim's perspective, if you are in a position to where you have questions on why this person is being released early, or why am I getting notices of that I have to go to a hearing 5 years before that I was scheduled to, get in contact with corrections, get in contact with the California Department of Corrections, but also get a hold of Stand Up for Victims. Shoot us an email, give us a call. Our website is standupforvictims.com. We will respond to your question. We'll put you in contact with the right people. Because sometimes what I find with victims is they just don't know what question to ask. The system is so large and overwhelming. And
right.
Organizations like Greg's and mine, we can make the world a little bit smaller. But I can't emphasize enough to have their voices heard. Call their lawmakers. Let their voices be heard on how they feel that this is endangering them. This is endangering the community. But they just got to get their voices heard. I could tell you, the advocates on the other side of this, on the decarceration side, they are well organized, well mobilized, well funded. They can go to people, to representatives' offices within 2 or 3 days. And that, in essence, that's a game changer for people. And lawmakers need to hear from victims because they can never question the sincerity of the pain that victims feel and why they're still being victimized every day with these changes.
No question about that. Well, I want to thank you both very much, not only for your years of dedication to public safety and crime victims, but just your continued work on such stuff. And I just, thank you for your insight. Thank you for your experience. For the listeners, I hope you go to their websites and sign out and learn more. So Greg and Ralph, thank you. To our listeners, you can find out more podcasts on InsideCrimeFiles.com. You can join our mailing list. And again, I'd encourage you to go to both those websites, GoldenStateCommunities.com and StandUpForVictims.com. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Inside the Crime Files is produced by Olas Media in San Diego, California. To listen to more episodes, visit InsideTheCrimeFiles.com. Olas Media.